We are just going to be giving a broad overview and introduction, give you an overview of the basics of qualitative research today, both in terms of the approaches and the methods. And we're also going to be giving you an opportunity to try some of that out as well. It's great there's so many people. We weren't originally expecting so many, so we're going to try and make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to have attention and ask questions and so on. And we have lots to get through, so we're going to make a start and hope that this is valuable for you. This is just the plan for today. So we're going to be giving you the sort of overview and introduction this morning, starting an activity on interviewing and moving into some data analysis, so basically how to make use of qualitative research that you might engage in or with colleagues and so on. We're now just going to do some beginning parts. My colleague Jody is going to get just some discussion going.
Okay, so we thought because qualitative research is all about understanding life views from different people that you come into contact with, we thought a good thing to start with is some discussion about who you are within your tables. And there will be lots of other group work throughout the morning and the afternoon, which are also based around your tables. So that's why we've asked you to sit together rather than on your own. So we've got, I think it's sort of 5 minutes at the beginning, where we'd just like you to speak to each other. And we'd like you to introduce yourself briefly, who you are, where you're from, and what you do in this context. And you've got some post-it notes on your table. And we'd like each of you individually, once you've introduced yourselves to each other, to write what is the main question or aspect about qualitative research that you would like to answer or understand today. And obviously we will try to address a lot of those in the work that we're going to do today. So don't just write, I want to understand qualitative research, because you will understand many aspects of qualitative research by the end of the day, but something a little more specific. What is it about qualitative research that you particularly want to understand today? What are the questions, or what is the main question that you have in your mind that drove you to come to this session over and above the other sessions? So 5 minutes, we'll stick fairly strictly to that because there's lots we want to get through. But if you could just introduce yourselves on your table briefly and each write what you want to find out from today, that would be great. So 5 minutes, introduce yourselves. And once you've written your question, you could go and stick them on that back wall and we'll take a look at them.
That's what we want. That's what we want. We welcome skeptics. No? So that's a perfect question.
I'm also working within the secretariat to support.
We have other methods you can use to
Coding and all this methodology.
I am using NVO, but I take the sample size.
Sample size.
कुन अमाउन्टमा गर्न ताकि त्यो मेच्योर
Do you all know each other now?
Yes, we've just done the interview.
Okay. And you have similar questions or different questions?
We haven't gotten to our questions yet.
Okay.
How can we generalize results? Notification, all this stuff.
Thanks for giving us your questions. You can browse those if you want to see what other people have written, and we'll hopefully we'll be able to address quite a few of them through the course of the day. Let me begin with a brief description of my work so that you have a sense initially of what a qualitative researcher does. I'm an anthropologist working on agriculture and food systems in rural South Africa. And I'm interested in whether small-scale farming offers a viable livelihood to people. And how farming forms a component of a broader, diverse set of livelihood strategies in a place where there are very few jobs in the formal economy. So I'm looking at how various different activities intersect. And I also look at the effects of trade and especially the expansion of supermarket retail into rural areas like this. And part of the reason why qualitative research is useful in this approach is that I'm not only interested on the effects of supermarket retail on dietary patterns, for instance, but I also want to understand its effects on the livelihoods of informal traders, on food practices more broadly and lifestyles, and on the changing rural landscape more generally, economically and socially. To get a holistic picture of these dynamics, qualitative research is necessary. Now, before we plunge straight into the methods, what I want to do first is to address some of the issues that make it so difficult for qualitative and quantitative researchers to communicate in a meaningful way. We all know, perhaps working with people from different disciplines and so on, that we can experience difficulties in kind of trying to do multidisciplinary work, even when we know that working together is a necessary part of solving the complex problems that we face. Now, frequently, qualitative researchers are called upon when it becomes apparent to aid workers, to agricultural researchers, to medics, to policymakers, to NGO staff, and so on, that local populations are not necessarily responsive to interventions, that perhaps people's behaviour may seem counterproductive to what those interventions are trying to achieve, or that perhaps mistrust between those involved in intervention and the recipient population seems to be mounting and seems to be getting in the way of these interventions. Perhaps there's an impression among people involved in intervention that something we know as culture appears to stand in the way of intervention. And at such times, often anthropologists or other qualitative researchers are called upon as important intermediaries. They might be seen as important kind of cultural gatekeepers or translators, mediating these complex and changing situations. So anthropologists and other qualitative researchers can therefore play an important role, but this can also raise a number of new and difficult challenges. For those of us working in these kinds of multidisciplinary teams, we know that there are often misunderstandings about the scope and the focus of qualitative work. Obstacles and widely differing perspectives are really typical, and so creating collaborations can sometimes produce disagreements and confusion. And speaking to some of you already in that brief exercise there, I know that some of you from quantitative backgrounds perhaps have a degree of skepticism about qualitative research. And so we want to really, we basically want to address this issue head on. So we want to open up the discussion now by looking at why these conflicts exist between qualitative and quantitative methods. So the purpose of this talk is to give you a better understanding of what qualitative research is, how one gathers, analyses and uses qualitative data. We'll be looking at those stages throughout the course of the day, and what are the opportunities but also the challenges of qualitative methods. Now, if I just zoom in on my subject, anthropology, briefly, anthropology is a subject that aims to understand how the world appears to others. So it can help with questions like, how do people think about, experience, or respond to interventions? How do people view the international teams that are sent to assist them? And how do institutions, politics, history, economic circumstances shape their experience and response to these processes? Now, let me briefly return to this issue, this relationship between qualitative and quantitative approaches. These approaches vary so considerably that disciplines kind of encounter their own cultural divide as they attempt to work together. I think of this disciplinary difference as a culture gap. It's a little bit like experiencing a culture shock when you travel overseas. And I like to think of academic disciplines as cultures, because in a way they really resemble how anthropologists define culture, which is the emergence and dominance of acceptable modes of understanding. And what we find that during our undergraduate training, we become so accustomed to one particular way of reasoning and thinking that we tend to develop a skepticism about other approaches. So those working with quantitative data and large data sets are often concerned about what they perceive to be the lack of rigor and the apparent difficulties of generalization in qualitative methods. And in turn, those trained in qualitative methods often feel frustrated that quantitative approaches fail to capture the social and political complexities of the particular contexts that characterize human behavior in a given situation. Now, what I'm going to briefly explain now is that below these divergent methods are actually a deeper set of epistemological differences. Epistemology is the philosophy of how we obtain knowledge. How can we claim that what we know is true? And what I'm going to suggest is that these two different approaches have very, very different philosophical understandings about how it is that truth can be ascertained. That, in other words, disciplines are underpinned by wholly different assumptions about what constitutes valid data, and more fundamentally about how truth can be acquired and can be known. And I would argue that if we understand these philosophical differences, which both have very, very long histories, we can somehow have a sense that looking across this gap, we can become more empathetic of different approaches. So I'm going to just do this very, very simply. You may or may not have come across deduction and induction, two very different modes of reasoning, resting on very different assumptions about how we come to know things. And I would argue the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning lies at the heart of many misunderstandings. Now, if you work mainly with quantitative data, you're probably most familiar with the deductive research process, and I've simplified that on the slide here. According to the deductive process, based on existing theories, one generates a hypothesis. Data are then collected in order to either confirm or dismiss the hypothesis. In contrast to this, the inductive process used by qualitative researchers, as you can see here on the slide, appears almost as the complete inversion of the deductive approach, and it's no wonder then that confusions arise. So in the simplified form here that I've depicted, data collection is a starting point, obviously with broad themes that you approach the field with, but data collection is the starting point generally, and this is analysed periodically as you go through. As this analysis proceeds, patterns begin to emerge, which form the basis of tentative hypotheses. Now, as more data is collected, until sufficient data forms the basis for formulation, until that point, you continue to collect data, and finally, when enough data is collected, you form a theory, and a theory is an explanation of the phenomena observed. So we don't begin necessarily with strict hypotheses. Now, so ingrained are these forms of reasoning from the undergraduate training onwards that they become taken for granted, kind of unquestionable methods for accessing and generating knowledge. They become the cultural bedrock of their disciplines, and we forget about the existence of other forms of reasoning. Now, the implications of an inductive approach are that the setting shapes the research, rather than the research question determining the boundaries of the phenomena being observed. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, how can this research be objective or generalizable if we don't begin with a clear set of definitions and boundaries? Now, this is where the different truth claims come in. Do we want to know the world as it objectively is, or are we trying to understand the world from the point of view of our informants? If the latter, then we have to accept that human situations are all open to multiple interpretations because there are multiple experiences of them. Now, anthropology is a subject which sets out to explain the world from the multiple perspectives of our research participants. Now, with this objective in mind, the deductive approach would be too narrow and the question 2 predetermined by the cultural assumptions of the researcher. An inductive approach is necessary. Although these look very different, what I would consider to be an interdisciplinary approach would be a fusion of these 2 approaches, using qualitative methods to establish the local understandings and important local categories that exist within a given context, and from those formulate hypotheses which then can be tested quantitatively. So hope is not lost. We can combine these 2 very different approaches, and the aim is to do that, and I believe that that's possible. I'm just going to touch on a couple more points. Now, particularly pertaining to anthropology, because one method that we're not going to go into a lot of detail in this session is the method that anthropologists use, which is ethnography. And ethnography essentially involves immersion in the social world of one's research participants. Anthropologists often live in the setting for many months. They often learn the local language. Of course, you really need to know the local language, because otherwise how will you understand local categories that become the defining categories for your research outputs? Often you spend time with your informants carrying out the activities that they do, and speaking to them and asking questions over time. And your research objectives may change through this process because they are being informed by what your informants tell you. Essentially, you're subjecting your own experience, putting your own body, your own thoughts and senses into that environment, so that over time you will learn what practices and beliefs are necessary to becoming a member of that particular world. The second element of ethnography is inscription. Every day you write field notes, you write about your observations and what you've observed that day and what people have told you. Now, of course, some may be saying, well, a different ethnographer might have written up the same event in a completely different way. Well, hopefully not a completely different way, but it is true that this method does rely on perception and interpretation. The purpose of this method, therefore, is not to unearth a singular, absolute and universal truth about the world, but is to approximate as closely as possible members' views of it. But this is an interpretivist approach. I'll just say I'll make one quick point about sampling, because this also relates to some of these differences between the 2 disciplines. Now, in terms of sampling for qualitative research, generally it's inappropriate to use random sampling for the collection of cultural data. Now, often quantitative people say, but that sample's it hasn't been done randomly, it's not statistically significant. The aim of qualitative research is not to be statistically significant necessarily. That's not where its validity derives. Instead, something called purposive sampling. I actually haven't made a slide of this, so you might want to jot this down. Purposive sampling is instead required, instead of probability sampling. This is because you have to select on the basis of particular criteria. For example, suppose you're interested in understanding why some people do not declare themselves to health workers when they become ill. Let's just say that's a question that you have in mind. Now, in the research, one would need to include people that fell into this specific category rather than an unbiased cross-section of the population, though this might also be helpful. So, therefore, for a purposive sample would select people who have been through the particular experience that you're interested in. If you want to find out about the history of a particular village, it's better to go to the elders and ask them rather than to do a cross-section of that village. For what's known as cultural data, you have to be targeted in your sampling. You select your informants based on the information you need or the themes that you're investigating. The credibility of the data is based on the suitability of the informants chosen. The aim is not to have a statistically significant sample. Instead, credibility of one's conclusions is enhanced by the repetition of the study, including further non-probability samples. So whereas qualitative data generally does not provide statistically significant results, what it does offer instead is interpretive depth. And that is what qualitative research allows you to do, allows you to achieve. Whereas quantitative methods might generate statistics as a way of, as a basis for a truth claim, anthropologists and qualitative researchers generate qualitative theories based on the amalgamation of data. Suffice to say that often qualitative research can be very much more complicated than just getting someone to sign a consent form, especially if you're spending months on end in the field. There are issues around this, and if you have questions, we can talk further. But often consent is an ongoing process, relying on the integrity of the researcher rather than a kind of bureaucratic box ticking on a consent form, although you might also do that as well. But there are complicated issues around ethics, and I'm happy to address any questions on that. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Lauren, who's going to introduce you to a range of qualitative methods.
So, as Lizzie has already described, one of the main methods used in particular in anthropology is participant observation. And one of the other key methods is interviewing. There are various levels of interviewing. The main one that would be focused on would be semi-structured, although you can do some structured and unstructured and still gain qualitative data. And Jody will be going into this in a bit more depth shortly, and we're going to then be doing an exercise on it later, so I'm not going to go into too much detail at the moment. You can also have, as part of sort of surveys and questionnaires, those would obviously be very structured, but you may allow for open questions to, rather than, sort of yes or no, or, option A, B, C, and so on. So they do also allow to capture some qualitative data. You can also do focus groups. This is quite an effective way of getting a particular sample of the, as Lizzie was mentioning about, targeting your sample and very purposefully choosing your subject. So you might, for example, want the views of several different people in a community who perform different roles there, and you might want to discuss the same issue with all of them together. You may want, for example, only mothers, for example, that you're targeting, and so you find a good sample and selection of people who would be interested and willing to participate in a focus group discussion. So these tend to be quite short, maybe around an hour or so long, and you have several different perspectives that you can capture at the same time. They're not as in-depth as participant observation or as in-depth as one-to-one interviews, but they can also be very valuable. You also get oral histories and life stories. This is a much more in-depth approach where it's all based on the interviewing, but you're asking for someone's biography, and you can explore many different themes and overlapping issues that have emerged throughout someone's life. It's very good for capturing history. It's also good for capturing perhaps a version and an experience of history that is not the one often told. So you may get the official local community government, for example, the local government giving their version of history, but there might also be other stories that are not told in that, and other events that happen that are not captured, and this can be a useful way to gather that. You can also have case studies, depending on what exactly it is that you're studying, and go into more depth around one particular issue. And there are also sort of archival and other various documentary sources that you can look into, and photography and video. So this is just a range of the main methods. It's not all of them, but these are the main methods used by qualitative researchers, some of which you may be familiar with already, and if you want to discuss any more, then do come and speak to us. Just a note as well on considerations of relationships and power dynamics. As Lizzie was referencing about ethics, it's important to be very aware of the ongoing relationships that happen. included in this is actually part of the rigour seen within qualitative research. Whereas often in quantitative, you don't really want to bring the researcher into it. It's all very much, it doesn't matter who the researcher is. The point is that it could happen, you'd get the same results regardless of the researcher. With qualitative, you actually, you acknowledge the influence that you may be having. So, for example, you may, a very sort of, the more basic ones, categories, you may acknowledge the fact that you're a female investigating a male world, and that therefore you may be getting particular bits of information that a male researcher might not be getting, that sort of thing, but also the power dynamics of how do the subjects see you? Do they perhaps see you as inferior or superior? How might that change some of their answers and the ways that they behave around you, the type of information that they reveal, and so on? It's also very important if you are ever using translators and interpreters. What's the relationship of the interpreter? Are they going to translate things slightly differently? There are many ways that you can translate languages. So is that going to affect things? Are they going to translate your question in exactly the same way for every single subject that you interview? And have they got a particular role in society that may affect the answers that your subjects may give? So these are things to be aware of when you're conducting the research, and it's actually very valid to include them when you're analysing and you're writing up your data and your analysis and findings. So I'm just going to talk also about the pros and cons. Of course, there are pros and cons to every method, quantitative and qualitative alike. So one thing that is that qualitative research can be very useful for is accessibility. You may gain access to environments and information that you wouldn't normally be shared with you, and if you were sort of going in and just doing some very quick sampling, for example. So, and this is incredibly useful where you have quite complex problems, especially in the area, for example, of food that we research, where everything from sort of governance, business, economics, biology, and culture all combine. So it also can reduce reactivity. Sometimes people can sort of react very quickly in the moment, or depending on what they perceive you might be looking for. Oh, I think this researcher might be asking about this. I'll answer that. Actually, there may be a misunderstanding, so it can give a bit more depth to some of the questions that you're asking. It can help, as Lizzie pointed out, it can help the relevance of survey questions. I've actually got quite a good example of this shortly that I'll be giving. So it can help you determine what questions you might need to ask, how you might need to ask them, and so on. So it can be very valuable for that. Creates intuitive understanding. This might not sound very scientific, but actually every person's understanding of the world is very intuitive. It's something that they've gathered throughout their lifetime from when they were children, depending on where they grew up and what circumstances. So a lot of understanding and behaviour in the world actually is down to this. So it can be very valuable in getting down to that level. It can give you the broader picture of some of these complex problems, as I mentioned, when they come across multiple levels. And it can also help provide explanations for inconsistencies in data, or when something goes wrong. Why, as Lizzie was mentioning, we thought we found the answer, but somehow it's not working. Something with the solution is not working here. And it can connect policy and practice in that sense. And many of these complex research problems require this kind of approach. Of course, there are also drawbacks as well. It can be incredibly time-consuming, especially an approach like ethnography, where you're spending many, many months on end. You need to gain the language skills, you need to gain the trust of the people, and so on. So that it can take a long time, and you can't get very quick answers often. Of course, the sampling representativeness, as Lizzie mentioned, we're not going for statistical significance here. So you can't necessarily provide that sort of data, and often that is also necessary, but that's where you can combine it with quantitative. the different qualitative methods may yield different results. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong or they're untrue. It just means that there are many versions of things. So one researcher may gain access to a particular group of people or a particular circumstance, and they may get some really interesting data from that. A different researcher may gain access to some different kinds of environments and get some slightly different information. So there can be issues with consistency there, and the other thing it's not very popular for is it can often unearth some inconvenient and messy truths, which people, they send you off to research one specific question, and you come back and say, actually, there's all of these other issues that we need to consider as well. And often people, they're trying to find a solution, and that sort of goes beyond what their remit is. So it can be quite irritating in that sense for some of your colleagues sometimes. And often there's no quick fix solutions. And especially with these kind of quite large, complex problems. These different methodologies can make it challenging to work across disciplines, although, of course, we are big champions of that not being the case, but it doesn't necessarily stop it being a challenge. So I'm just going to give an example now of some research that I conducted a few years ago. The study was looking at malnutrition and intervention programs amongst rural agricultural workers in 2 different small communities in Guatemala. I used ethnography, so I was using a mix mainly of participant observation. I also conducted some focus groups and some semi-structured interviews. So the main problem in this area is that there's very chronic malnutrition, so a huge micronutrient deficiency. There was also some issues of double burden where there was of malnutrition, so there was also quite big problems with diabetes that was very related to the diet as well. There were several intervention programs taking place, but they were not having the positive impact that they had hoped to achieve. So I was looking at why this might be. The assumed causes of the malnutrition in the first place was that there was a lack of education, and the cultural norms meant that people had very specific dietary preferences and were resistant to change, and that also there was a lack of money and resources. So people figured out, okay, these seem to be the problems, therefore we're going to develop these interventions, and this should solve the problem. So the 2 main interventions that I was looking at, this was aside from fortified foods, which do exist in the country as well. But the 2 main approaches are ones that are quite often seen in intervention programs. So one was that there was food aid given out locally. This was actually used not so much to provide people with free food that they needed, but actually to entice them to come along on a regular basis and have their children weighed so that they could measure the rates of malnutrition. And they would also give them talks, informative talks whilst they were there, for example, on safe food preparation. And the other one was that the local health centre would train local members of the community and to deliver cookery workshops to help improve the type of foods that they were cooking and the diet, and therefore improve the nutrition. This was targeted to the mothers whose children had been weighed and identified as the most severely malnourished children. So there was another assumption here. The assumption is that because all of the women all the food preparation is done by women, that the most effective place to focus the intervention was on the women. So that was another assumption in the solutions. But the challenges that they were facing and the results that were not happening, they didn't have very good attendance and engagement in all these variety of activities that they conducted, and even when there was attendance, there wasn't necessarily much change happening at the household level, and therefore in the levels of malnutrition. So one of the findings that I came to was that although all of the responsibility was put on the women, however, they were often the least powerful and the most vulnerable, and actually had the least ability to change anything in the diets of their households. So that was one of the biggest findings that I found, that was perhaps unexpected and certainly not what people running the intervention programs imagined. There were very defined gender norms, so this meant that men and women were defined by their feeding and non-feeding roles. So men were quite simply not allowed anywhere near the kitchens, and the women's value as being women was primarily for nurturing. And so if their children, their roles as mothers, and even if they had other jobs, which most of them did, their main value and sort of respect came from being a good mother and having children and looking after their family. So this meant, however, that when they were identified as having malnourished children, there were huge issues to do with a sense of failure, a sense of shame. They were often felt quite insulted, having been told their entire lives that, taught how to cook to feed their families. As an adult, they're now told that they can't do that and they must come and learn how to do that. And this created all kinds of complicated tensions. There was also a huge amount of pride. The women didn't mind at all having this responsibility. This related to much wider complex issues to do with the role of maize in society. So they ate maize tortillas with every single meal, and sometimes, in fact, when there was no other food, that was all the family lived off of. But maize had a very important role in their mythology, in their own creation stories, in the Mayan religions. There are gods of maize. They have stories about how they were made of maize rather than any other material, and so on. So it runs very deep. And the making of the tortillas is incredibly time-consuming and laborious. But the women, this was a real place of honor because, they were responsible for producing this maize sustenance to all of them. There was also quite high levels of domestic abuse, very high levels of domestic abuse in all of these households. And at the end of the day, it was many of the men, even though they weren't preparing and giving the food, they often had the ultimate say on what was consumed. So if maybe the women went back and tried one of the new foods that they'd been taught in the classes, so even the most sort of engaged women would then go and try this at home, and if the men in the household didn't like this, they couldn't really do anything about it, and they had to go back to how they were cooking before. Of course, the men weren't receiving any of this information about what was important because it was all targeted at the women. And they often also had the financial control and tended to earn the money in the household or more money. There was also a very high literacy rate in this area, both amongst men and women, but men were seen as being prioritized for education. So when women were asked to leave the house, leave their cooking responsibilities, and spend a morning in a workshop, in a classroom, in an education setting, a lot of the men were very skeptical about, is this really the best use of your time? So that was sometimes prohibiting people attending. So there were also, it was quite interesting. So I mentioned that how qualitative research could add to quantitative surveys, for example. So in a fairly standard diet sort of nutrition recall survey, you ask people what it is that they've eaten in the last 48 hours or what they typically ate. I asked people in my semi-structured interviews just some of the main things that they consume in their diet, and over half of my respondents didn't actually mention maize tortillas at all. It was seen as so obvious and such a staple and integral part that they simply wouldn't even mention it because, it went without saying. I was then able to probe further, and I'd noticed that, in the long list of foods that they gave, they hadn't mentioned maize tortillas. So I would then say, what about maize tortillas? Well, of course, that goes without saying. Why are you even asking? Everyone knows that, maize is the staple food. They couldn't imagine that I didn't grow up with maize. They thought I must have been hungry all the time and were amazed that I grew tall, having not consumed maize as a child. So they think it's completely an obvious thing to eat, so they wouldn't even mention it. So if I had then informed a more quantitative survey, or if someone had conducted that survey and they hadn't either had maize on there, or it could have been missed entirely, and that would have really altered the results that they gained. And there were also some inconvenient additional findings. I was saying sometimes the research throws up even more inconvenient truths than people would like. So actually, aside from all the other findings I came to, there were huge issues with safe drinking water and sanitation. There was no refuse, waste removal and disposal. This meant that contamination and sanitation was a huge problem, and this actually was one of the main factors contributing to malnutrition. If someone got, for example, diarrhea from the poor water, it didn't matter if you gave them a great diet. They weren't going to be able to absorb it. And these related to much higher levels of local governance and state provision and so on. And so again, they were sort of focusing in slightly the wrong area, but then it was calling into question these much bigger problems that are more difficult to address. So that's just an overview of an example of some research, and I hope that's been useful for seeing how some of this all fits together. We're now going to move on to the first activity, and to get you to start trying out some of your some interviewing. So Jody's going to give an overview of interviewing, and then we're going to start the first activity.
Okay, so far you've heard an overview of why qualitative methods are used, and some of the kind of assumptions that underlie those and the differences between qualitative and quantitative, and an overview of methods and an example of when some of those methods have been used. And what we want to do next is, because we can't cover every single method in depth in the 3 hours that we have, we want to focus on interviewing as a very common method in qualitative research, one that you're most likely to use probably if you're starting out in doing qualitative research. And the interview is obviously distinct from the participant observation that Lizzie was talking about, because you're not spending all of this in-depth time with a particular group or in a particular context. It's usually a one-time thing. Maybe you might go back for multiple interviews, but you're capturing a snapshot in time, or you're asking someone to look back, but you're not spending that in-depth time with them. It's also distinct from focus groups. Because in a focus group isn't just a multiple interview. In a focus group, you would choose to do a focus group because you're explicitly interested in the interaction between the people in that group and what that interaction brings additionally to your information. So an interview is usually with one person. So an interview is usually one-to-one and is usually one-off. So that's how it's distinct from some of those other common methods that we've mentioned already. So qualitative interviewing is a very frequently used method in social research. It's generally distinguished from questionnaire-based interviewing, as you might get in a survey, even if the form of communication is the same. So you're sitting face-to-face with another person, but the way that you're interacting with them is different in a survey to in a qualitative interview. And it's that difference that I want to go into today, with the assumption that most people generally are more have more experience with surveys. So some interview styles might produce quite structured data on people's opinions on a specific matter, and other interviews facilitate a more sort of evocative communication of people's life experiences, their activities, their emotions, their identities, and that's what we're interested in this particular case. So in qualitative interviews, the interviewees are given space to expand their answers and accounts of their experiences and feelings. So their answers are very definitely not pre-categorized as they would be in a survey. Rather, people are given the space to explain their own circumstances as they would prefer to. So qualitative interviews are often used in a more exploratory manner, which seeks to investigate people's interpretations of the social world. So they don't necessarily presume that most of the topics of interest are known in advance. So the aim is interpretation and understanding of how and why, rather than fact-finding or getting answers to questions of how much or how many. So there's a clear distinction. So interviews have been described as a conversation on life in a professional form. So the interview is a conversation, it's an interaction between two people. You don't know exactly how it's going to go, but it does have structure and a goal beyond the purely spontaneous. It's not just a chat. Okay, so it does have structure, but you're also allowing it to go further than that. So interviews do require careful questioning. They require you to think in advance about what you're going to ask about, but it also requires careful listening so that ideas beyond those original questions can be explored. And so interviewees are given space to talk about the themes that you're interested in their own way. So interviewing as a method has been described as an art as much as a science. The analysis is a different question. That's a science as well as an art. But the actual interviewing is really, there is an art to it. There's no single procedure, but there certainly are common processes and strategies, and that's what I'm going to go into here, so that you've got an overview of how this is done. So there are different types of interview, broadly speaking. There are structured interviews, as Lauren's already mentioned. So those tend to ask the same set of sort of standardized questions to different respondents. You're getting responses in predetermined categories to confirm or disconfirm hypotheses, and they're useful to make comparisons between responses from different interviewees. At the other end of the scale are completely unstructured interviews. So they're not simply answering the question posed by the interviewer, but the interviewee has a freedom to tell their own story or their own life history or biography. And those are mainly concerned with finding meanings and attempt to develop a sort of detailed biography of that person's life. What we're going to talk about today is sort of the one in the middle, which is most often used, so semi-structured interviews. So you would have an interview schedule, a kind of guide, which has topics and maybe some specific questions that you're going to follow. But you're very explicitly allowing for the exploration of emerging themes and ideas. So it's not just yes/no answers to the things you already think you know. You're allowing additional things to come up and you're exploring those. So there is scope for pursuing and probing for novel, relevant information. So choosing which type of interview to use depends on your research question, obviously, and it also depends on who you're interviewing. With some people, it's going to be more or less possible to use these different kinds of interviews. You know, if you're interviewing a policymaker, he might not have 5 hours to give you to go into his entire life history. You might need something a little more semi-structured or structured. So there are always things you need to think through when you're designing your research. But today we're going to look at the most common one, which is these semi-structured interviews. And in semi-structured interviews, you can move between different types of questions. So you might move from more structured questions in the beginning. You know, can you tell me a bit about your recent past, or can you tell me a bit about your work in food policy? And those questions, they gather information, but they also put your respondent at ease. They're easy questions for them to answer. You're not going straight in with, you know, something on gender-based violence or something on a person's experience of their own health, which is sometimes a little difficult to answer. So you can move from those more structured questions in the beginning to some less structured questions towards the end, where you explore topics in more depth and you're following through some of the things that come up in those interviews. Okay, so the semi-structured interview is what we're going to focus on today, and they're more flexible than sort of standardized methods like the structured interview or the survey. So the interviewer in this technique will have some sort of established general topics for investigation. As I say, it's a conversation in professional form. So you're going in to start to try and understand a particular topic. But this method, the important thing is that you can follow these emergent themes and ideas. You're not only relying on concepts and questions defined in advance. So that's where the skill, the art comes in, is being able to follow some of these topics. And the idea is that knowledge is gained from the interviewee's viewpoint. So the interviewer would usually have a standardized interview schedule with a set of questions or topics, and you would tend to ask the questions in a similar order in your different interviews so that you've got some sort of consistency throughout the interviews in a semi-structured interview. And additional questions or themes to explore might be noted on your interview schedule, or they might come up in the scope of the interview. So the idea is that the research data comes from the interaction between the interviewee and the researcher. You can't always define in advance exactly how it's going to go. So when you're looking back at the data, one of the things it's important to know when you've got a transcript of an interview in front of you is how formal or informal the setting was, because that will affect this interaction between you and your interviewee, and how comfortable the interviewee seemed, because then you can interpret the data in context. So when you're doing interviews, you may well record the interview if there's consent given, but you should always make notes either during, if that's possible, or immediately after the interview. Just your notes of your reflection. Did the person seem comfortable? Did he or she seem like they were giving you the sort of information that they felt comfortable with? Or were they uncomfortable and therefore maybe not getting to the topics that you wanted to get to? So your reflections on interviews are always very important to capture as soon after the interview as possible before they fade. We always forget when we're running to the next one. So key skills for semi-structured interviews are remaining open to these emerging issues that come up during the conversation while you're sticking broadly to the interview schedule so that you don't get completely lost and go off as you might do in an unstructured interview into other interesting areas. You want to bring it back to your topics, but make sure you can explore some of these interesting areas that come up. So you've got to have enough knowledge about your topic that you can follow these conversations off track and know when you need to go off track, while not imposing your own views on a topic to the respondents. A lot of us are experts in whatever it is that we're interviewing about, whether it's nutrition, food systems, diet, health. You've got to suspend your beliefs in an interview. You've got to let the ideas of the interviewee come through, even though we know that we have our forms of knowledge about that topic as well. So that's the skill. So within an interview schedule that you'll go into this interview with, your guide, there are different types of interview questions to get at different types of information. So you might be looking at behavior or experience, you might be looking at their interviewee's opinions or beliefs. You might ask about their feelings, what they think of as their knowledge, or you might be looking at something about their background or their demographic information. There's lots of different sort of types of information you might be looking for. So you might usually include various different forms of questions in an interview. So there's what degree of focus do you need from your questions? Are you looking for the sort of general overview of a person's life or thoughts, or something specific? So a question like, please could you tell me a bit more about that issue? And then there's the degree of open-endedness of a question. So a very open-ended question would be something like, how do you feel about this topic or this issue? So those are used to understand people's perceptions. And then a more closed form of question would be, do you agree with the idea about this issue? So you're closing down what the interviewee can respond. So it's used to maybe confirm findings or go back over some issues that you've already covered. And then there's the different types of information that you're looking for. So something descriptive, could you tell me what happened when? Some kind of structured information, so which factors do you think are involved in this issue? So people are more likely to sort of list factors there rather than go into something in more depth. Contrast, so maybe contrast over time. What changes have you seen since a certain time? And sometimes you might want to follow up with clarification. If an answer doesn't immediately ring true with you, you don't need to let that go, because when you look back at your transcript later, a week later, a month later, you'll think, oh, I wish I followed up on that. So feel free to ask, can you just clarify what you mean by that? And again, with a follow-up, if you don't think they've completely finished telling you all the information you want about a topic, can you just tell me a bit more about that? So there are all these different phrasings that you can use. They seem sensible, they seem obvious because we all use them in our everyday conversation. But to include a range of these different types of questions will mean that you get different types of information and different depths of information from your interview. And then a final slide before we go into our exercise. So when you're undertaking an interview, there are various things that you need to think about beyond just the sort of question and answering, which is what we think of mainly in an interview. So establishing relationships, you want to put your interviewee at ease. You don't just want to go in there and start demanding information. You want to communicate your aims, ask permissions, be sensitive to their body language. If they're sitting there frightened or they're sitting there arms crossed, or, have that little conversation at the beginning to make sure that you're comfortable to have a conversation. And then using the interview schedule itself, your interview guide. So it's generally a reminder and not a list in a semi-structured interview. So, don't be here reading your interview schedule, and hiding behind it. Try to know your interview schedule quite well in advance, so you don't have to refer to it too often, unlike I'm doing here. You want to be able to follow leads in an interview, so they might be body language. As someone starts to relax, they might lean forward, and you think, okay, well, I can start to ask some of the more interesting questions now. Or people might get more away from you during the scope of the interview. So be sensitive to those kind of cues, but still try to get below the surface and uncover as much data as you can within the confines of the interview. And then capturing the data, as I said, most researchers use audio recorders and then later have those transcribed into transcripts for analysis. But depending on the context, either some people might not want to be recorded, or other people will be happy to be, but you also might want to take notes of your own impressions as these interviews go before they fade. So just some additional things to think about there. And so the slides that I've just presented, we're going to give out in a couple of minutes, and they will be there for you to refer to as we go into the exercises. So the exercise is going to be in 2 parts, and it's going to help you to apply this information in practice. We want you to design an interview schedule that you would go into an interview with. So I think we've probably got about 10 minutes for this. So with our research question, we tried to think of something that was broad enough that would interest most people who had come to a conference like this. So I hope it grabs your imagination. So we want to know what influences people's food choice. Okay, now that may or may not be directly relevant to your particular area, but we would like you to create an interview schedule to address that particular question. So you can either work alone if you feel comfortable like that, or work in pairs. If you work in groups, we feel like that's too many cooks, too many people. So alone or in pairs. Remember to allow for the exploration of these emerging ideas that might come up in the conversation. Frame your questions so they explore a topic rather than lead to specific answers, and include a range of those different types of interview questions that I was talking about, and we'll give those out now. So you have about 10 minutes to start thinking through what would you ask a respondent, someone in this room it's going to be, to start to explore what influences their food choices. Any burning questions about the particular exercise? We will have time for more general questions about qualitative research later. Okay, and we'll be coming around as you're doing this, so we will, we can help you if you get stuck, but go ahead and start thinking about that question.
What questions are you going to ask?
Because it's a semi-structured interview. Is that right?
मेरो इथनिसिटी होइन मेरो वेल्थ मेरो चाहिँ कल्चरको कुरा भयो
डिस्कस गर्नु पर्यो अथवा उसकै चोइसको लिएर आउँछ भन्नु
इन्टरभ्यू नै हो, फोकस ग्रुप त होइन नि। इन्टरभ्यूको लागि हो।
You could have almost like some starting questions and then almost like an option A. Option if they say this, it might be good to then ask this kind
In
of
reality, of course, you will, because you'll be doing research on that topic, you will have that in mind. But I think for the purposes of this exercise, being open to whatever information comes back at you is the best approach. But of course, it's impossible to frame the interview without having some sense yourself of what.
So you need to prepare yourself first of thinking for yourself what would be the...
If we
we ask the question directly.
Because it's less calorie, so we...
How much time, if you're preparing food, how much time do you have and why is that and how does that affect your...
Rather, we'll ask what are the sources for those food that they have eaten. Like, then we'll know why did they choose.
You're pre-thinking what they might answer.
Not really.
Okay.
Something like that. We're pre-thinking what might be the answer as well.
That might be one thing that comes up. But what about other things? That might not be the main thing. Try to make your questions so that people can explain their world. Do you see what I mean? So you generally have fewer questions in qualitative interviewing.
If we consider all these factors, then end up in an order.
I need to follow and ask, okay, why is that and is that normal for you? And
It's really it differs per culture, right?
Yeah, culture.
Even between these two communities, while the one group ate...
So just a couple of things. In qualitative interviewing, you generally have fewer questions, not very many questions, based on themes you want to explore. So you need to sort of suspend your own ideas about what might come up in those questions, phrase your questions so that they explore their own experiences. Now, you may well think of other topics that might come up as they speak, and feel free to put sort of bullet points underneath your question to think about things that you might want to explore later on. But your main questions should be as open-ended as possible so that they allow your respondent to think, because there will always be things that come up that you didn't already know.